Well, it is 2:29, so I'm going to assume that we have a good number of our delegates online already. If you are, you're very welcome to this Brightspace webinar, Lag Behind or Lead with Purpose. We will, of course, just leave a minute or so for others to get online and catch up before we completely kick off. So a formal welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us. We're expecting between 30 and 35 delegates for this session, which is excellent. I'd also like to thank our excellent cast of panelists for sparing the time in not only sharing their experiences with us today, but also giving a lot of thought to the webinar beforehand. If I can just introduce our panelists, a very brief word about myself. My name is Simon Slater. These days I have a small portfolio of non-executive directorships, and one of the hats that I wear is as a specialist advisor to and with Brightspace Communications. Let me next please introduce you to Kathy Innes, who is Head of Marketing and Business Development at the accountancy firm Ecovis, Wingrave Yates. We also have Elliot Moss, Partner and Chief Brand Officer with Mishcon de Rea, the law firm. Ben Gerdelson, who until very recently was Head of Communications at Slaughter and May, but is now a Director at Byfield Consultancy, the leading legal PR consultancy. And finally, Ingrid Brown, who is founder and principal of Brightspace Communications. So once again, thank you to all of you for the work you've done in preparing for this. Briefly, the format of this session will be that I will lead off with some questions for each speaker in turn, and we'll focus on their particular questions for about 8 minutes a time. Whilst we are allowing for a Q&A session at the end of around 15 minutes, do feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom, and between us, I and Naja will keep an eye on those questions as they come in. And if we feel that they are of relevance at the time during somebody's session, we will introduce those questions. If not, we'll store them up for the Q&A session at the end. So I think that's enough about the format. Naja, can we share the 2 slides, please? Thank you very much. So the background to this, you may or may not be aware, is that we, Brightspace, conducted some research in the tail end of 2021 into the top 50 accountancy firms and legal practices in the UK. On the back of some research that I had seen conducted by KPMG, which itself declared that 64% of large corporates do indeed have a clearly stated purpose, and not only that they're successfully embedding that purpose in everything they do. And we thought it was a good idea to discover the extent to which those companies' advisors, their accountants and their lawyers, were keeping pace with their own development in this area. And so here are the results. We found that 26 of the top 50 accountancy firms did have a well-defined purpose. What do we mean by purpose? Well, we mean, if you like, a purpose that transcends what it is that they obviously do, which is to provide accountancy services. But what in addition is their higher purpose? And with law firms, it was a little less. 21 of the top 50 legal practices have a clearly defined purpose. So the gap on the second slide. Naja, thank you very much. Between the clients of those law firms and accountancy practices and indeed their advisors is not insignificantly, 17%. So hence the title of this session, Lag Behind or Lead with Purpose, ? There's clearly more to be done to ensure that these major law firms and accountancy firms align themselves with the very businesses that they advise. I think that's it. You may have read an article based on that research that Ingrid had published in Professional Marketing magazine a month or so ago. So there we are. I think that's enough from me. Hopefully, most of the delegates that are due to join us today have now joined. If you've joined in the last few minutes while I've been talking, you're very welcome. And without further ado, I will move on to address some questions to Kathy Innes of Ecovis Wingrave Yates. So, Kathy, my questions for you are, why is it that you think accountancy firms lag behind when it comes to defining and embedding purpose? And more specifically, how is your firm, which I know is in the process of doing this, how is it embedding purpose, and what have been the noticeable business drivers in so doing?
Okay, so yeah, I think it actually depends on where the firm is on their purpose journey. So if they're right at the beginning and they've never even heard of Simon Sinek and that famous TED talk that he did, where people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it, the golden circle, then they're right at the beginning, because that's really all about how this is what actually inspires people. This is how you can attract business or attract employees and retain them. Or they could be at the next stage where they know all about Simon Sinek and they don't believe a word of it. They think it's just marketing stuff, it's just fluffy. And so they don't really support the evidence that shows that the financial success and cultural success that comes with purpose-driven organizations. So they're still talking about differentiating by being better or quicker or faster or cheaper, whereas you actually kind of need more than that to really differentiate yourself in the market today. Or they're at the next stage where they're like, yeah, we've got it, we need a purpose, we're going to be purpose-led. And they're like, right, come on, Kathy, you're in marketing, off you go and make us a purpose statement. So I'll sit in my office on my own in my silo, create a purpose statement and go, oh, that's great, done, all done. And then when you launch it to your people, your clients and everyone, they're all like, yeah, they don't connect with it because they had nothing to do with the creation of it. So unless you sort of involve, multiple stakeholders, from clients to suppliers to alumni to employees, leadership, the founder, and you ask them those key questions, what does the world need? What are we good at? And what do we feel passionate about? You're not going to get a purpose statement that's actually going to resonate and is genuine and authentic. Or otherwise, they could be the next stage where, a bit like us, we've created a great purpose statement. We feel like we've done it really authentically. It's really genuine. People get behind it because it was all sort of co-created. And you think, right, that's it, job done. When in actual fact, we're right at the beginning, because you have to embed it and you need that commitment. This is quite a long-term plan. You've got to embed it in the strategy and the culture of your firm. It can't, otherwise it will just be that statement on the wall. It won't be, it'll go no further. So that's really, I think it really depends where you're on the purpose journey to find out where, why firms aren't picking it up. But as far as embedding it goes, which is kind of where we are now. So we created our purpose, we really dug deep last year, actually. It seemed like the right time to do it, particularly with all the COVID and everything, and really look at everything in our priorities. And the purpose statement that we actually came out with, which we worked with our stakeholders with, was inspiring better business by leading with humanity, fostering trust and empowering change. And we felt, this is really clear. Hopefully it's inspiring and it's very authentic because we have co-created it. So now for us, the key is telling our story, which is kind of what we're doing now. It's all about using language that people understand, that's meaningful, that's memorable, maybe creating the media and the channels to tell that story. So we've just gone through the whole journey of, we've just rebuilt our website, rewritten it with the right tone of voice and everything, and made sure it's really purpose driven. And then we're now working through all of our assets. So whether it's recruitment brochures or proposals or, new starter packs, it's all about the purpose. It's all about the purpose and the values. And then we sort of look at, right, who's going to be our storyteller? So it's not just me in marketing, so we need those partners, the leaders of our firm, to really communicate it internally and externally. And then I guess it's about, embedding it in everything we do. And it's all about, start with the purpose, feed into the strategy through through your sort of vision, and then through your mission, and then through your positioning and your values and your CSR strategy. Let it be part of all your decision making. So, whether you want to do business with certain clients or suppliers or take on employees, do they actually align with your purpose? Do they kind of get it? Or maybe you're thinking of a new service line, and the first thing you should start with is, does this actually fit with our purpose? And are our customers going to benefit from it? Can we actually deliver on it? And then is it actually going to make us money? But you have to start with the purpose. And then I guess it's all about embedding it into our systems and our processes, whether it's, our recruitment process right from the beginning when they read about us on the website, or they download our recruitment brochure, or, what it's like in our interviews, the questions we were asking, or perhaps it could be part of our appraisals, so we should be celebrating and rewarding, purpose-led behaviours. So that needs to be in our appraisals, and we need to be setting those potentially KPIs to measure against it. So I guess, as I say, you've really got to be committed to this. It's not a light thing to take on, but it's incredibly important. It's not just fluffy, it's real. So I hope I've answered that question.
You most certainly have. Thank you very much. Let me just see if there happen to be any questions coming through so far. No, not yet. Now, feel free, any other of the panelists, to ask questions at this stage. But perhaps I could just kick off, Kathy, and pick up on something that you said then. So as I understand it, the stated purpose is to inspire better business, which I like very much. How long did it take the cynics in your firm to maybe not necessarily get completely on the bus, but to stop trying to derail? I'm mixing my metaphors here, but just to push the bus off the road.
Do I think I might be a bit lucky in the firm that I work for, because, to be honest, they always were purpose driven. They just didn't really articulate it. And I think, so the way I approached it was I actually created a guide to, why it's important to lead with purpose. So before we started on this whole project, the key is to get that buy-in. And I shared it with our partners, and they took it to their partner meeting and they digested it, the evidence, the great companies that are leading with purpose and how successful they are, and how I would plan to go about this study and get everyone's input, and the surveys that we'd create and the little ground groups that we would do. And so I basically got their buy-in, and actually it didn't take long, because they're that way inclined. I'm not saying all firms are going to be like that, but ours is. And so, I was quite lucky. And then, of course, I then could approach the founder of the business and various alumni and various clients and various suppliers. And we either did little interviews or they did a survey. I got all that information back, all that data. And it was a real sort of scientific exercise. I loved it. Big fat spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet. We're accountants. It doesn't need to be fancy software. And you literally put it into chunks, into themes. And I didn't know where this was going. I was a little bit nervous, okay? But the reality was, it just came alive. And I couldn't actually believe how it just made sense. And once you start putting all these things into chunks and into themes, it all became really clear. And once we actually felt we created something and we kind of explained what leading humanity means, etc., and drill down to it, we then put it out to everybody and went, well, this is what we've come up with. What do you think? Because it's not set in stone, and you have to get that, they need to really look at it, and we make tweaks and make sure it sounds right and it's right. And so once we'd done all that, then we were like, right, okay, so share the story. We created a little video, a cool little video about our journey, which I really liked, good music, blah, blah, explains the story, and then we're off. But as I say, the trick now is embedding it into our business, because otherwise it is just going to be a marketing exercise and nothing more.
And it's early days, but do people know that their behaviours are going to be recognised in the future?
No, but I guess the other thing is the way you do it. We're not going to be all bossy about it.
No.
It's actually, this is part of our culture. This has, and so for example, people that have just started, they're seeing it right from the very beginning, and it's not going to be this weird new thing. I mean, it's a bit like values. It's not a new thing that we're doing. This is not new. It's what we do when we're working at our best, which is what we talk about with our values. Our values aren't, well, these are great values, put them on the wall. It's actually what we do, what we're actually doing. So it's not like as I said, I didn't sit in my office and I didn't come up with a purpose statement, which I thought was cool, or other people have got. I thought, oh, I like that. We actually, because we generated it, if people are measured against it, well, it kind of makes sense anyway, because actually we should be leading with humanity. We should be fostering trust in various ways. So, yeah.
I think before I quickly move on to Elliot, I think you make a really valid point, which is that I think for many organisations, what they've done actually is to articulate much more clearly, more or less what they've been doing historically, but without really recognising that that's what they've been doing. And from in my experience, those are the best purposes actually, because they're real and they're true. So thank you for the moment, Kathy. Don't go away, because there may be questions later on. Elliot, on to you. I will repeat this question, but this time it's in relation to law firms. And of course, law firms are actually not just lagging their clients, they're in this research, they're lagging the accountancy practices. Why do you think that this is the case? And secondly, are you able to tell us how in your firm you've gone about making purpose work for the business and its people, and how you're measuring the value that that it's creating?
Sure. Well, Simon, lawyers are brilliant, right? I mean, they don't need statements of the obvious to help them understand why they do what they do, which is probably the attitude of most law firms until recently, because of the history of the way that lawyers have been, rightly in some ways, super prominent in a world where business is predicated on the rule of law, and where the justice system is critical to the functioning of a modern democracy. The role of a lawyer is really important. And if the role of a lawyer is really important and quote unquote self-evident, then why do I need to go around telling you why I exist? I've already told you why I exist. I'm really important. And I ensure that we uphold the rule of law, and I protect you, and I help you write contracts and help you sell businesses and protect your families and so on and so forth. And I think defining a purpose for a coffee company that makes a product versus defining a purpose for a group of people called professionals, whether they're accountants or lawyers, are two entirely different exercises. One is about the beliefs of the founders, and I recently met, a few years ago, actually met the founder of Packed Coffee, which has recently got some funding because it's advertising all over the underground. Well, that's all about purposeful, fair trade coffee. Anita Roddick was talking about fair trade finding of ingredients 30, 40 years ago. It's not a new thing to be, for products to be able to say, I'm an ethical, well-meaning product and therefore company that wants to do good things in the world. For a lawyer who charges by every 6 minutes and who commands enormous fees, and law firms historically have done very well in this peak law environment, and maybe it will change. There was no need, and there is no need. Technical expert services is a very different ballgame, and I think that underpins on the worst hand. I was joking, of course, at the beginning about the brilliance, but on the worst version of that is that the arrogance says, I don't need anything other than my brilliance, my technical brilliance. And the best version of that says cynically, well, if they've got one, I better get one. And that, truthfully, neither are great motivators. And I think there's a nomenclature thing going on over here as well, and where it all sits. If, and you sort of mentioned it, if a business is already behaving in a certain way and people treat each other in a certain way, then that's definitely a benefit. If you set up a business and your core values, one of the things Kathy said, are genuinely to act with integrity and frankness, believe in being unconventional, unconstrained by being creative, and you want to help people fulfill their potential. Some of the values that we have at Mishcon, those values predate any sense of articulation of purpose, because they are what defines the business. Now, as it happens in the Mishcon case, those values were only written 22 years ago. I say only because the firm's founded in 1937, excuse me. So I think values are important. And I think mission, we haven't talked about mission of a business, is really important. And I think the role of purpose is a kind of coagulant of all these things. It needs to pull together the various aspects of a business strategy. And I think for some law firms, they think, but I've got the best lawyers offering great services at a super margin. I don't need to have any other purpose other than doing great legal work. And I get that. And I have respect for that on one level. But on another level, it ignores a human truth, which is that we all need purpose in our own lives. Whatever we do, whether we work or we don't work, we all need to know why it is that we bother getting up in the morning and what drives us. And I think that basic human truth is what's been around business since the Cadburys were in business, and since the Guinness company was in business, and since any other company that said, you know what, there's a higher purpose here than just making chocolate, making beer, building houses, building railways. Actually, we can do something good. And that isn't, I mean, unfortunately, it's been hijacked by the corporate agenda, and it's driven by the genuine truth of climate change and all these other things. And on one hand, it's great that everyone wants to have a purpose, because that's important, because we're destroying our planet, and we're not going to have any business to deal with because there won't be anywhere to live. But on the other hand, I go, what a shame, because actually genuinely purpose-led businesses are really great places to work. And that's what this is really about. It's about getting people to stay and getting more people to come that you love. And so if you get a group of people that all understand what the gig is, and they all understand what makes it fun, and they all understand that they're going to make more money next year versus last year, then purpose is a good thing. If not, it's just wallpaper, window dressing, whatever else you want to call it. And I think the issue is that and I think it's changing, but the issue has been in the legal industry, at least, I don't think it's been necessary, because it's just always been good. I think now there's a challenge for talent. There's a challenge there's a really big commercial impact of the incredible bubble of salary increases, or I suppose in the context of wider inflation and so on. So that's why I think it's probably not happened as fast as it should. And there's another thing which is related to marketing, and I'll be honest about it. I think most businesses care more about how they're going to sell than how they're going to behave. Of course, the two are inextricably linked, but I would say without embarrassment that when I started working with Mishcon as someone from the world of advertising, we were creating what we call a brand essence, which was helping us articulate the promise of the brand externally. In years now, recently, we've always had a purpose, but we've now, to your point, we've articulated. But those things, the purpose, the essence, the values, all these things are part of the matrix, and they're not. And Kathy's right; they're not just marketing tools; they're M&A tools. They're what happens if we go public. What's the story tools, for example, which is relevant to us. So I think it's understanding what this thing is for, and I think businesses that really want to be sustainably positive and sustainably profitable need to think hard about why they're in business, because that the existential question is the question really at the end of it. If you want to differentiate yourself, if you don't, and you bring in £2 million per profit every year because there's 10 of you and you do 3 types of work, then good luck to you. But for most normal companies where we're in the real economy, we have to fight for talent and we have to fight for clients, and standing for something is really important.
Thank you very much, Elliot. Did you put your hand up then, Ingrid? Or?
I did. I just wanted to follow on from what Elliot's discussing, because I think, Elliot, we've had a prior discussion, and I think at the core of your business, obviously, are your people and the employees, and obviously, you know, the contribution. And I know that you've done a lot of work around purpose and values, and you know, to actually retain and attract employees, because I think we can all agree there has been more of a demand from millennials and Gen Z now, like for purpose, but also their work to be purposeful. So maybe just a little sort of chat about, you know, how that works for you.
Yeah, I mean, I slightly differ with the Kathy the Cathy view of involving everybody in writing statements. I get why people do it, and I think it's really important to say for anyone on the call now, it's utterly important that you do what's right for your business, and that by definition culture is it changes and it evolves, and it's about the people in the petri dish, and my people are different to Cathy's people, and so on and so forth. So there's no one size fits all, but in our case, defining purpose and values was a smaller exercise, and then it's shared, because it's really hard to I think it's really hard not to get to lowest common denominator statements of the bleeding obvious. And so to find that specialness, you have to be a bit smaller, and then you have to be brave, and you have to help you involve people. And I may be less of a Democrat than I ought to be, but that's the way it works here. We have
the business as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean yeah. So it's not so that part of it in the definition is one thing, but the way it evolves is then about involving people in those conversations as you go, and consistently looking back at them. So we on an ongoing basis analyze our core values. We have and interrogate, I should say, and everyone does that. We have something called Mishcon Voice, where everybody has a voice in the business on a regular programmatic basis to talk about and to share what it is that they think should change. And by the way, what is behavior? Behavior is just your values in action. So those behaviors of, do we give away fruit in the reception or not, or in the canteen, may sound small, but that's a really big point. For example, it might be a big point. So the way that we have addressed the points around what does a millennial need, you know, I laugh at this, because when I was a millennial, and when we weren't called millennials, whatever I was, Gen something, I'm 51, in the early 90s, some of us were driven by purpose just because we were. So I just think it's become more of a label. But the truth is, I think some people, it's not a quantifiable number, always believe that there was a reason that you wanted to work with right-minded people that believed in diversity, that believed in flexibility, that believed in accountability. So the way that we've ensured we do that is to bring those values to life. So when we've looked at our flexible working policy, written 5 years before COVID, and we were out there with unlimited holidays, a bit like Virgin, we were doing all those things, not because we were trying to be cool, but because we thought that was the right thing to do to ensure that people want to work here. And by the way, we get it wrong as much as we get it right, but it's about listening to people, and it's about involving them. And the truth is, Ingrid, to answer your question, it's pretty messy. You know, I never leave. I never ever stop blooming working, it feels like at the moment, but metaphorically never leave going, aha, my job is done. Everyone understands our values and everyone's perfectly aligned to the purpose. And today they're super happy. I wish, you know, I've got to watch a better program on Amazon tonight to take me to that world. But there's no great magic to it apart from going, it's serious. And then there's a whole bunch of other things, which is about measurement. And I think, Ingrid, to just the last part of the answer to the question is, when you are a business who's actually giving purpose advice, as we do, we have a business called Mishcon Purpose. And its purpose is to deliver the purpose framework to clients, which is an 8-step thing around your values and your culture and your ESG, your stakeholder engagement and your inventory of capitals and your audit of that, and all of your analysis of all your processes. When you're actually doing that, and that is your craft skill, then people inside the business are also going to be aware of that and susceptible to it and feel part of a business that's actually offering that kind of advice as well. And I think when you have that, it at least gives you the best chance that a 27-year-old super bright individual will say, do you know what, I love working at Mishcon because the kind of work I do is that kind of work. We do consultations that are to do with the Human Rights Act. There are things which are intrinsically part of the day job. So maybe our law firm is slightly better placed than some other law firms, and that's why it's easy for us, because of the nature of the work products.
Great.
Thank you both very much. Lots of really interesting points in there. I just wanted to pick up on two, which are sort of at extremes from one another, really. One is this whole thing about, you know, why do we get out of bed in the morning? It's as you said, it's a very human, it's a visceral thing, really. You know, we don't get out of bed to count beans. Do we really? I don't think so. And then the other point was that, you know, we better get a purpose because everyone else has one. And because we're people businesses, how can we create one that isn't just, a vanilla version of the firm next door? And I dare say these will be points that will be picked up subsequently. Let me just check there are no questions just coming through before we just move on. Not yet. Good. So Thank you so far. Ben, good to see you. My questions for you are, why do you feel purpose needs to be embedded into professional service firms? How important, I think this is the crucial one for you, how important is purpose in driving reputation? And what advice would you give to a professional service firm that has yet to define its purpose? So tackle that any which way you like.
Thanks, Simon. Wow, some big questions there. I think before I address them, just speaking kind of personally as a communications person, I have found the sort of concept of purpose and the discussion of purpose incredibly complicated over the last few years. All sorts of definitions, all sorts of literature, stuff I've read. I've obviously come from a firm which is reasonably conservative, but still very interesting. And I think it's this, just before I move on to answering the questions. I think to really get what your purpose is, you have to understand as a business and as a collection of individuals what it is that you hold in the palm of your hand. What is it that you have? What is it that you can control? If you're a law firm, it's a number of things. It's the ability to advise, to support, to fund. And I think too many descriptions of purpose in firms that I've seen, professional services, have been like the UN, and I just don't really see how that matches what the reality is of being a law firm or an accountancy firm or a management consultant, etc. But to answer your two questions, what a slightly cynical answer to the first one is because stakeholders are demanding it. I think the last, well, exactly 2 years have been absolutely fascinating. The majority of which I've spent at Slaughters. You've got, the whole time of the COVID pandemic has been bookended by George Floyd and BLM at one end and the war in Ukraine at the other, with the Sarah Everard tragedy in the middle, net zero, etc. And I think there's been a significant number of reference points where firms have slightly uncomfortably had to define what they stand for against those things. And I think the war in Ukraine has been a visceral example of that. Now, I'm going to be very careful not to name firm names here, but I think we'll kind of know who we're talking about. When something as seismic as this happened, I think it really shone a light on what firms stood for, what they were willing to do and not willing to stop doing. And I think that, sadly, is probably a better thing to articulate what really firms have as their purpose than what firms have necessarily said. So, the difference between, the UK headquartered firms, withdrawing from Moscow, and coming out and condemning what's happening, etc., compared to some of the US firms, some of which said very, very kind of loose things, some of which said nothing and did nothing. I think that tells me an awful lot more about what why a firm and its individuals gets out of bed in the morning than some statements that I've seen. Sorry to be a little bit cynical. There was a fantastic Sunday Times editorial, I think maybe it was the Thursday when Putin invaded, wasn't it? And it was Oliver Shah writing on the following Sunday, I think March 6th, where he was basically saying that the past few days we've seen ESG just blown out of the water in terms of what it stands for in the corporate space. Brilliant editorial. I urge you to read it if you didn't. I think what was very interesting were some of those social events that I talked about. With George Floyd and BLM, there was some very sort of uncomfortable statements. And I remember at Slaughter May, there was a lot, I don't think I'm sort of talking out of shot, but there was a lot of pressure on management to say something. And that was the first time that had happened. And it was a really positive line in the sand. And they came out and they've obviously said something now on Ukraine. They did on, poor Sarah Everard. And I think it's been a really, really interesting time. But I just kind of refer back to what I said at the beginning. I think a firm really, really does have to fully understand what it holds in its hands to be able to articulate what its purpose is. Just for amusement, if nothing else, there is one FTSE company who's, and I fully agree with what Elliot said about mission. One FTSE company has a mission statement: building a better tomorrow. Does anyone know who it is? It's not AstraZeneca, who are probably building a better today with their vaccines, or someone like Barratt, who are actually building houses. It's British American Tobacco. And call me cynical, but I slightly suspect that they might not be building a better tomorrow. So these things really have to stand up.
Indeed. Thanks very much, Ben. I remember going back, this is a point that Elliot made really a bit earlier on. This is not, none of this is really very new. I remember 30 years ago working for a quoted professional services firm at the time, 30 years ago this is. So it was a large firm of chartered surveyors. And we had financial PR consultants. And I remember the account director saying to me once, if you don't stand for something, you stand for nothing. And I think that's the rub really here. The danger of not having a higher purpose, unless you are the most brilliant technical experts, and frankly, just don't need to do this, is that you become vanilla in a very crowded marketplace. So that's one point I wanted to make. The second was, you mentioned the ESG agenda and it being blown apart. I don't think it was part of that article you were talking about in the Sunday Times. I read elsewhere, and I'm sorry I don't have the source, but I read, and I quote, while 70 of the top 100 global law firms claim to be advising clients on ESG, only 17 of them publish ESG reports themselves, which I think is interesting in itself. And I just wanted to pick up on the sort of general thread of what you were saying, Ben, which is it seems to me that it's right, where appropriate, to have a clearly defined purpose. But I think what you're saying is that actually it's almost the deeds that matter more than the words.
Yes, and yes, the deeds have to match the words. I don't think they necessarily matter more, but they have to match. And I think recent events have shown that they don't. I think a fascinating, I have not done the analysis, but it would be useful to do so. If you look at, COP26, which feels like a million years ago now, but it wasn't, it would be very interesting to see what's happening with that agenda and what law firms are doing compared to their approach to, acting for, big oil and gas companies, given what's happened. That environmental agenda is, I wouldn't say on pause, but with the rather desperate situation that we have, in relation to kind of oil and gas at the moment, particularly in somewhere like Germany, which relies so heavily on Russian supplies. Where is that ESG agenda going? How do you marry the two things up? And I remember again at Saltrame doing some really interesting work around purpose in relation to acting for fossil fuel clients, Shell, BG, etc., and how you justified working for those types of businesses. And the answer is, well, look, if those businesses are going on their own journey, then if you're helping them do that towards a sort of more environmentally friendly world, then that's okay. And I wonder what's happening to that, to that now, where it feels to me as if that agenda around more clean energy is slightly differing because of what's happening. So how do you keep consistent in the face of events? I don't know.
Elliot wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think that fossil fuel point, and also, Ben, the fact that values, you're right, the point is about the statements, they're irrelevant and if the actions are contradictory. The fossil fuel thing, we've always said we'll act for fossil fuel companies who are trying to go on a positive journey, because otherwise if you're not in that tent with them, then you've got no hope of bringing them into the tent that you'd like to bring them to. And it's very easy for us to talk about that on a call when we're not involved with billions of trillions of dollars of business and all the complexity that the war has brought and all of that to supply chain issues. I think on the other point though, just on the responses, and I think communications can be limited in a very febrile environment. What I mean by that is they're critical, Ben, and you're absolutely right, but the amount of complexity around statements around the war and around what companies do and will and won't do, I can just tell you that we, in good faith, at Mishcon de Reya Towers, said that we would not, whilst we would absolutely not act for state-owned enterprises and any associates of the regime and so on, the obvious, right? And by the way, we don't act for state-owned enterprise anyway, and we didn't, and all those businesses that are shut in Moscow so virtuously have got no business in Moscow virtuously. You know, that's the truth of it, let's be honest. But for us, it's different. But there was one thing we said, which we got pilloried for, which I don't think we will do in the long term, which is that we said we will, of course, continue to act for Russian clients who have no relationship. And by the way, some of those people are facing extradition charges from the regime. And that nuance of saying we won't discriminate based on nationality because that's in alignment with our core values and our purpose, that nuance gets lost in the short term. And so I think you're right about the palm of your hand, but unfortunately there are some titillating stories out there which can affect a company, a titillating choice of stories to run, which can affect the way that a company holds the line. And I think, again, back to values and back to purpose, if you really have a strong one, then you have a strong backbone, but it isn't always helped by stuff that one reads. And I think it's a really important point about confidence in general and businesses. And you've got to really believe. If you don't believe, then you haven't got a purpose anyway.
Can I agree with that and add to it briefly? So I think the situation in Russia is a real case in point, but increasingly, you know, all these kind of issues and things are very binary, aren't they? You know, everything Russian bad, you know, everything else kind of good. And there is nuance there which hasn't really come out. And because of the pace of media, social media, all that stuff we all know, firms have to jump to a position, I think, more quickly than they may have done, you know, a decade or so ago because of that. And I have a little bit of, you know, sympathy. I mean, I don't think any of us really know the, you know, intricacies of what goes on in Russia. I'm sure there's just bog standard M&A and financing and all that kind of stuff. And I was very pleased actually that my old firm came out and said that it was going to maintain its relationship with its so-called Russian best friend, who, as far as I know, don't act for any oligarchs or anything like that. And they just do legal stuff that goes on in Russia. And I thought that was right. And I was pleased to see that.
Thank you, guys. I'm just mindful of time, but before I move on to Ingrid, it just occurred to me to ask you, Kathy, does Ecovis, does that have a member in Russia or Ukraine for that matter?
They do. And yes, there's also a charity that they've got, which is Ecovis and Friends. We're all supporting that charity and trying to fund projects in Ukraine at the moment. But I know as a marketer, we've basically removed any reference to Russia in our signature and everything like that. So yeah, it's tricky for us because yes, we've got offices in Ukraine. I mean, the day the war broke out, I was meant to have a meeting with Anna, who's in our Ecovis office in Ukraine. And of course, she didn't turn up because they'd just gone to war. So yes, it definitely affects us. But no, we're all trying to raise money to try and help projects out there, trying to help orphanages and things like that. So yeah.
Sure. Good, thank you. So Ingrid, why is purpose essential for the success of a professional service firm or any organisation for that matter? And what, in your opinion, are the critical steps in ensuring it's done with rigour and delivers that success?
So I think following on from the other speakers, I think for me it is the fact that a professional services firm is part of the knowledge economy, and I think they have a massive responsibility in terms of influencing, building trust and inspiring. And I think, but obviously at the core of that is its people. So for me, we mentioned this idea that, it comes out time and time again in research, that employees do want to work for a company that will stand behind something, and they want their work to feel purposeful. So yeah, and then I think with that, I think there's a huge level of disengagement as well, which is odd. I think, you know, there is a survey that's been done, and it's as high as like 89% of people in work can be disengaged. So there's an opportunity, I think, to use purpose and your vision and values to actually inspire and engage your employees. And I think obviously the more engaged, the more happier they're going to be, the more productive. And as you know, with clients, that's what they want to see. And I think the increase now in the client demand and the transparency that exists is making it quite critical. I mean, interesting for me in what I've seen in a lot of law firms, just onboarded a client and having looked at a lot of sort of websites, one of the things I see emerging now is culture. So it feels now that everyone's differentiating or by culture, but in effect, what I'm actually seeing is everyone just saying we've got a great culture and we have a culture. Now every firm has a culture, and I think the work that Kathy did, I think what she did ultimately was a culture assessment, really, of how people were working, what they liked about the way they worked, speaking to clients in the cultural experience they get by working with your people. So it does come back to people, and it's a shame that it seemed to be a fluffy exercise, but actually in professional services firms, that's the people and the experts that you're selling. So it's really, really important. And I think moving on to having worked with clients to help them, if you like, articulate purpose, because I do think quite often it does exist, and I just think it hasn't been articulated. And I think, Kathy made a good point to the fact that a lot of companies are actually, delivering their purpose on a day-to-day basis. But one of the things for us when we start the journey, we've got a framework that we do use, and it does start with value. And what we do is we unpick and look at the value that you do. So to your point, Ben, of like what you have in your hands, it's actually, well, what actually does that value create for the world, the community, your people, your clients? So it's really drilling down. But one of the things that we find is by starting with purpose at the top of that value framework, we will work with the leaders first. And by working with the leaders first, because we need to see them walking the talk, or talking the walk, walking the talk. Yeah, sorry. And I think what I found with that is there's quite, it can feel really uncomfortable. Because it involves a lot of retrospective thinking. It involves maybe managing partners in the law firm to actually be very aligned, to have uncomfortable conversations, and it doesn't feel like business as usual activity. So I think it perhaps isn't given that. But I think the increase in transparency, and I think the push from employees is just meaning it can't be ignored anymore. So and really just agreeing with the approach that Kathy has taken, I think it can work no matter what size actually your firm is, because I think it's not unlike any exercise, even a branding exercise, where you are looking for common themes. It's a culture assessment, so you can do it, and we've done it by using quant, using focus groups, looking regionally. And most firms will be there will be some common themes because they've come out of the culture of that business, because that culture has emerged and it's found its ways of working. It's got the values to guide them to work in that way. So one of the things that I've kind of noticed for us to make it really work for a business is that someone needs to own it. So there needs to be that head of purpose. If you look at the top four, you'll see, as leading professional services, like you say, who are advising companies to do this, they have to be seen to walk the talk as well. So you'll find that they have a head of purpose now, and it's not head of sustainability. It's a different role. Elliot, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I know we're running out of time, but just to say, I'm not sure I agree with that. Funny enough, again, but it depends on each company. But I think blanket kind of need a head of purpose. Then it gets into the Kathy danger of, as she articulated so well, it's not me in my room just doing this stuff. I think purpose is owned by the management team. It's owned by the board. It's owned by, in the case of PLC, the PLC board, and in other cases, the general board, because the role that I play, for example, it moves into business operations and right across to communications and through impact and into client relationships and new business by design. but that I'm just one of the stakeholders along with my head of mission on purpose, which is a business unit rather than purpose. But then he happens to lead the impact team internally, and then the chief exec or our chairperson rather than our managing partner are all big owners. So I think actually for us, it's more of a collective where there's at least a good 5 people who are the buck stops them. I may be the spokesperson on the board, but the board own, or the key people on the board own it. So I can see why there might be the need for that, but I sometimes think that's a bit of a special operations role, and the next step is leaving the building.
I think you're right, and I think it is operations. I think it is like an operational role, and I think that's why sometimes it's been sort of pushed to one side and maybe given the responsibility of someone in sustainability, who are purely kind of looking at things from an environmental perspective and probably won't see the social value in the governance side as strongly. But I think that, yes, you're right to say it, but what we have found is when we've created a program and we've helped the business and it's there, cascading, and then like Kathy said earlier on, making that part of everyday business and driving change, someone needs to sort of ensure, or if you like, become the guardian of it, because yes, it is responsibility, but if they're all bought in and they do change and they are aligned and they believe it, then I think you're right, it should work. But my experience is if they're at the beginning of the journey, they need someone to keep that momentum going, because I think that's when we get like a purpose gap. I mean, there was an interesting study that came out from McKinsey, and they did say that, like, whilst 89% of employees recognise their company might have a purpose, only 40% said it was effective, and they could see evidence of it being effective. So I think that kind of gap between purpose and its implementation, I think needs to be closed. So that's probably why I'm advocating having someone, sort of owning it internally.
Ben?
Yeah, I just want to add, I think there's another gap actually. I think I think there is a gap between what people think purpose is and just good stewardship. So people kind of box ticking ESG, CR, requirements and things. People think, well, okay, if we're doing the right thing, then that's purpose. It's not enough to demonstrate what you're doing, but you should be able to articulate why as well. And it's a pretty obvious point, isn't it? But I don't think everybody does. I think that firms talking about, if you look at COP26 and science-based targets and things, there was a lot of announcements of firms doing good things and great, we want to hit net zero by 2025 or whatever it might be, but people articulating why, I haven't seen as much of that as I would perhaps want.
And I think interestingly enough, I think for sustainability, purpose, having a strong sense of purpose will actually drive the social and the well-being side. I think without that, I think, like you say, it becomes more.
The other one actually, sorry, is the gender pay gap. I was in the weeds of that because the Slaughters director of HR was hauled in front of a Commons Select Committee by Rachel Reeves, which I was really involved with. But what happened that year and pretty much a lot of years afterwards, but I think a lot of firms would list their gender pay gap, which was never great because of the way firms are structured, and then list all the things in their document as to what they were doing, in terms of, targets and all this sort of stuff and initiatives to help, women stay in the business beyond being a senior associate, so the partnership pool didn't drop and all that kind of stuff, but not really why. It was a good thing, and I still think we're at that point with the latest kind of gender pay gap, announcements. It's full of good intentions, which are obviously great, but not really articulating why. And I think we can be a little bit more thoughtful.
And I think that's an interesting point about the why, because again, I think for a lot of these firms, that transparency and that type of transparency is not something that they're used to.
Yeah.
It feels fact-based. So, it's being brave enough to say that you're trying and you have an intention.
Yeah.
Ingrid, sorry, people, I'm just not mindful of time, but I'm also mindful of the fact that we do have a question that's come in online. Before I come to that question though, Ingrid, are there examples of organisations, perhaps in other sectors, I don't know, financial services or engineering or whatever, where you've seen examples of these businesses derive real long-term financial value from doing the right thing?
Well, interestingly enough, so within professional services, I am doing some work at the moment with Arup, and I think everyone's familiar that Arup have a very strong sense of purpose, which was to shape a better world. So that was created when the company was founded. And interestingly now, with sustainable development, when you look at what Arup have done throughout, and you look at how sustainable a lot of their work has been, actually they have truly lived to their purpose. So much so, in fact, that they don't talk about it now as much as they should do, which is quite interesting, because it's just become part of how they operate, how they think, and it's just a known thing when you join the business. But actually, I think for them now, with lots of their competitors moving into sustainable development, their sense of expertise and knowledge in this sector has probably been a little bit like drowned out by a lot of noise. So actually, there's an opportunity, I think, for them to actually take that purpose, look at the legacy, and actually talk more around the impact that they've had actually on shaping a better world. So because they actually have got a lot of evidence to show that. So that's a strong one for me. And again, having done some work in financial services, we can see a lot of work with the major banks that have done it. We've all seen a change in how they now market, how the transparency and the talk being customer focused. When in the old days the bank had all the power, I think the need for banks now to build trust and to compete. We're seeing a lot. We see it on the TV now. We're seeing it, banking group, helping Britain prosper is a great example. Yeah. So, yeah.
Let me bring in this question that it's a part comment, part question from Cho Shan Halford, whom I know. It says, for some businesses, the purpose question is easier to define. For example, an agency advising on environmental PR. How do other firms who are feeling under increasing pressure to articulate their purpose achieve this and distill this purpose in all its employees, when some individuals in reality do a job because it pays a salary and who are perhaps disengaged with or are not interested in the purpose of its organization? Walking the talk is probably more challenging in reality than on paper. Anyone want to pick that up?
I'll go first. I think it's a good question. And if I look at not so much the kind of big four, but if I look at the sort of demographic perhaps of Elliot's firm and my former firm, compared to big global organizations, quite small businesses, and I would be presumptuous enough to argue full of quite bright, engaged individuals who are willing to challenge and want things. And it is a bit of a bubble, compared to a big corporate. And do people care? And why should they? In terms of if I have a lot of respect for people to say, right, I'll go and do a job. They'll pay me money and I'll go home. And maybe this whole debate is a little bit of a privileged bubble. Who knows? I mean, it's a slightly cynical view, and I'm not saying it's mine, but it's one to consider.
Interesting point, because I spoke actually a few months ago around purpose in front of CEOs of hedge funds. So global hedge funds, and they are built around compensating and making money. So it was just that sense that actually what we found at the end and through that discussion was, they just want to make money, but actually they are seeing more pressure now from some of their employees that just want something else. Isn't enough, and they're getting burnt out, and there's mental health issues now as well, because they end up creating high stress environments.
I think the competitive environment we're in right now, particularly within professional services, and most particularly within the legal sector, the competitive environment for retaining and attracting talent kind of makes it an imperative, actually, in my view. I'm just going to look at the watch here. I think it is about 3:28, something like that. So if you'll forgive me, Elliot did want to make just one final
Yeah,
comment.
just to answer the question, I think if you take Nike's purpose, Nike makes obviously trainers and all that stuff, and they have people with all different sorts of intelligence and doing all different sorts of roles. And I'm not saying everyone would be able to go on the shop floor, this is what Nike stand for, but I reckon most people would get it. Their purpose is to unite the world through sport, to create a healthy planet, active communities, and an equal playing field for all. If Nike can do it, and Nike's a pretty well-run company, though someone will probably pop up and go, no, let me tell you how awful their supply chain is, and they're doing something in Bangladesh they ought not to be. But let's assume it's not that. If they can do it, then any company can do it with all sorts of different people. I think that's the point. If you really do have an ethos, if you really do have a purpose, and that gets translated into all different sorts of people doing all different sorts of jobs, and it's not dependent only on intellect, I think.
Yeah, point well made. Thanks, Elliot. I think it falls to me to wrap the session up by saying a big thank you to all of the delegates that have joined us today. I hope that you have found this helpful in some way. Particular thanks to each of our panelists, as I said before, for devoting their valuable time to joining us today.